So Canada just locked the United States out of a critical trade corridor that handles $900 billion in annual commerce, and the economic implications of what happened this morning should concern every American who buys gas, groceries, vehicles, or really anything that depends on cross-border supply chains functioning smoothly. The Canadian government announced restrictions on key border crossings and trade infrastructure that effectively block or severely limit American access to routes that have operated seamlessly for decades. And Warren Buffett, who rarely comments on geopolitical developments, just issued an emergency statement about the economic consequences of severing integrated North American supply chains that's causing serious alarm among business leaders and policymakers. It's honestly hard to believe we're watching what amounts to an economic blockade by America's closest ally and largest trading partner, but when you understand what actually flows through this corridor and what Buffett said about the cascading impacts, you'll realize this isn't just a diplomatic dispute, it's a supply chain crisis that will hit your wallet, your job prospects, and the entire North American economy within days. This isn't a threat or a negotiating position. This is actual implementation of restrictions that went into effect at 6 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. Trucks carrying goods from the United States are being turned back at major border crossings. New permit requirements that take weeks to process are now mandatory for commercial vehicles. Inspection protocols that previously took minutes now take hours. The Detroit-Windsor corridor, which handles about 27% of all U.S.-Canada trade by itself, saw massive backups forming within the first hour of the new restrictions. The Peace Bridge connecting Buffalo and Fort Erie has similar delays. The Pacific Highway crossing between Washington State and British Columbia is experiencing what logistics companies are calling complete gridlock. Let me be very specific about what this corridor actually is, because understanding the physical infrastructure helps you grasp why this is so devastating. The US-Canada border isn't just a line on a map. It's a network of bridges, tunnels, ports, and crossing points that handle an extraordinary volume of commerce. The Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor is the busiest international border crossing in North America. About 8,000 trucks cross that single bridge every day, carrying approximately $323 million worth of goods. That's one bridge. One day, $323 million. The Blue Water Bridge between Port Huron, Michigan and Sarnia, Ontario handles another 2.5 million trucks annually. The Peace Bridge processes 1.5 million commercial vehicles each year. The Pacific Highway crossing sees thousands of trucks daily moving goods between Seattle and Vancouver. When you add up all the major crossing points, and there are dozens of them along the 5,525-mile border, you get to that $900 billion figure. That's not an estimate or a projection. That's the documented annual value of goods and services that move across this border through this network of crossings. Now, what actually moves through these crossings? Let me break it down by sector, because the diversity of goods is staggering. Automotive trade accounts for roughly $300 billion of that $900 billion total. Every major car manufacturer in North America depends on parts and components crossing the border multiple times during production. An engine might be cast in Canada, shipped to Michigan for machining, returned to Canada for assembly into a powertrain, then shipped back to the US for installation in a vehicle. That's 4 border crossings for a single component, and it happens because decades of optimization made the border essentially invisible for manufacturing purposes. Let me give you specific examples of how this integration works and why the corridor closure is so devastating. General Motors operates assembly plants on both sides of the border that function as a single production system. The Oshawa assembly plant in Ontario produces vehicles using components manufactured at GM facilities in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Those components cross the border, get assembled into vehicles, and many of those vehicles then cross back into the United States for sale. When the border becomes a barrier instead of a seamless connection, this entire system breaks down. Ford's situation is similar. The company's iconic F-150 pickup truck, America's best-selling vehicle, uses engines produced at Ford's Windsor, Ontario plant. That facility produces about 500,000 engines annually that get shipped across the Ambassador Bridge to assembly plants in Dearborn, Michigan, and Kansas City, Missouri. If those engines can't cross the border efficiently, F-150 production stops, period. Ford doesn't have alternative engine production capacity that can be brought online quickly. The Windsor plant was built specifically to supply those assembly plants. Stellantis, the parent company of Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram brands, has similarly integrated operations. The Windsor assembly plant produces the Chrysler Pacifica minivan using parts from dozens of suppliers scattered across both countries. A typical vehicle contains about 30,000 individual parts, and tracking where each one comes from is nearly impossible. But industry estimates suggest that for vehicles assembled in this region, Somewhere between 30 and 50% of parts value crosses the border at least once during production. Some components cross multiple times as they move through various stages of manufacturing. The supplier network is even more complex. Magna International, headquartered in Ontario, is one of the world's largest automotive suppliers. The company operates over 340 manufacturing facilities globally, with significant concentrations on both sides of the US-Canada border. Magna produces everything from complete vehicle assemblies to individual components like mirrors, seats, and electronic systems. When border crossings become unreliable, Magna's ability to serve customers on both sides deteriorates, which cascades through the entire automotive production system. Linamar, another major Canadian supplier, manufactures precision-engineered components including transmission systems, driveline systems, and engine components. The company operates 60 manufacturing facilities in North America, and its business model assumes parts can move freely between facilities based on production needs and customer requirements. Border restrictions that add days of delay or introduce unpredictability into shipping schedules make the entire just-in-time inventory system that Linamar and similar companies depend on unworkable. Energy accounts for about $200 billion. Canada supplies roughly 4.3 million barrels of crude oil to the United States every day, about half of total U.S. crude imports. Natural gas flows south through pipelines at a rate of about 95% of all U.S. natural gas imports coming from Canada. Electricity generated at Canadian hydroelectric facilities keeps lights on in New York, New England, Minnesota, and other states. When you flip a light switch in Buffalo or heat your home in Minneapolis, there's a good chance Canadian Energy made that possible. The energy infrastructure that enables these flows is massive and irreplaceable in any short time frame. Enbridge operates a pipeline network that moves about 3 million barrels per day of Canadian crude to U.S. refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast. The company's mainline system, a series of pipelines running from Alberta through the northern United States, is critical infrastructure that took decades to build and can't be duplicated or replaced quickly. If political tensions reduce the reliability of these flows, or if access becomes contingent on political considerations rather than commercial contracts, the entire system's value proposition changes. TC Energy operates the Keystone Pipeline System, which, despite political controversy about expansion, has been moving Canadian crude to U.S. markets for years. The company also operates extensive natural gas pipeline networks. Natural gas is particularly critical during winter months when heating demand spikes. The Northeast and Upper Midwest depend heavily on Canadian gas because domestic production in those regions is limited and alternative supply sources would require building infrastructure that doesn't currently exist. Electricity integration is less visible but equally important. Hydroelectric facilities in Quebec generate enormous amounts of power, much of which gets exported to New York and New England through high-voltage transmission lines. During peak demand periods, hot summer afternoons when air conditioning loads spike, or cold winter mornings when heating and lighting demands surge, this Canadian power helps prevent blackouts and grid instability. The interconnected grid was designed with this cross-border capacity in mind. Trying to operate without it requires either building new generation capacity or accepting reduced reliability. Refineries present a particularly acute challenge because they're capital-intensive facilities that can't be quickly modified or replaced. The refining capacity in the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin was optimized over decades to process heavy Canadian crude from oil sands. This type of crude requires different refining equipment and processes than lighter crude from shale formations. A refinery configured for heavy crude can't just switch to processing light crude without expensive modifications that take years to implement and might not even be economically viable. Marathon Petroleum's refinery in Detroit, for instance, processes about 140,000 barrels per day of primarily Canadian crude. If that supply becomes unreliable, the refinery either operates at reduced capacity, which means job losses and reduced output of gasoline and diesel fuel for the regional market, or it undertakes expensive modifications to handle different crude types. Neither option is attractive, and both involve significant economic pain for workers and communities that depend on refinery operations. Manufacturing goods beyond automotive machinery, electronics, industrial equipment account for another $250 billion. Agriculture and food products make up about $150 billion, with everything from Canadian wheat feeding American livestock to American produce showing up in Canadian grocery stores. The integration is so complete that trying to separate the two economies would be like trying to unscramble an egg. It's theoretically possible, but practically devastating. So when Canada locks the United States out of this corridor, they're not just inconveniencing some trucks. They're disrupting supply chains that feed factories, fuel refineries, power homes, and stock grocery stores. The immediate impacts are already visible. Automotive plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky are reporting parts shortages that will force production slowdowns within 48 to 72 hours. Refineries in the Midwest that process Canadian crude are frantically trying to secure alternative supplies, but there aren't easy alternatives. The refineries were specifically configured for heavy Canadian oil and can't easily process light crude from Texas. Grocery distribution networks that depend on smooth cross-border flows are seeing delays that will translate to empty shelves in border region stores within a week. Construction projects that use Canadian lumber, and there are thousands of them because Canada supplies about 1/3 of U.S. lumber consumption, are about to face material shortages and price spikes. Every sector that assumed the border would remain open and efficient is now scrambling to adapt to a new reality where that assumption no longer holds. Now, this is where Warren Buffett comes in, and the fact that he's commenting publicly on what is essentially a geopolitical action tells you how serious the economic implications are. Buffett released a statement early this afternoon that was distributed to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders and subsequently shared with the media. Here's what he said, and I want you to pay very close attention to the language. The integrated North American supply chain represents 75 years of optimization, investment, and cooperation. When political decisions sever those connections, the economic damage isn't limited to the immediate disruption. Businesses built on assumptions of cross-border efficiency must fundamentally reorganize at enormous cost. Some simply won't survive the transition. Think about what he's saying. Buffett isn't predicting that this will be resolved quickly or that markets will adjust smoothly. He's warning that businesses are going to fail, jobs are going to be lost. The economic architecture that made North America one of the most productive regions on Earth is breaking, and putting it back together, if that's even possible, will be extraordinarily expensive and time-consuming. This is Warren Buffett, who has built a fortune on patient long-term investing and who generally views temporary disruptions as noise. When he says some businesses won't survive, he means it. The statement continues with specific concerns about sectors Berkshire has exposure to, though Buffett doesn't name individual holdings. He notes that energy infrastructure companies face revenue uncertainty if cross-border flows become politicized. Manufacturing firms dependent on just-in-time delivery across borders must either invest billions in inventory buffers or accept the risk of production stoppages. Retailers who source products through cross-border supply chains need contingency plans that may not be feasible given the scale and speed of the disruption. It's honestly hard to believe Buffett would issue such a direct and alarming statement about a geopolitical situation. He's famously cautious about weighing in on policy matters, preferring to focus on business fundamentals rather than political developments. But according to people familiar with his thinking, Buffett views this as fundamentally an economic issue, not a political one. Regardless of who's right or wrong in the dispute that led to this lockout, the reality is that integrated supply chains are being disrupted in ways that will cause real economic pain for real people and real businesses on both sides of the border. So why did Canada take this dramatic step? What triggered a decision that will cause significant economic pain to Canada as well as the United States? Understanding the Canadian perspective is essential to grasping why this is happening and why it might not be easily reversed. According to statements from Canadian officials, this action comes after what they describe as years of American trade policies that treated Canada not as a partner but as a subordinate. Tariffs imposed on Canadian steel and aluminum on national security grounds, threats to cancel or renegotiate trade agreements, public statements from American officials suggesting Canada should be more compliant with U.S. demands. The immediate trigger appears to have been a U.S. policy announcement last week that Canadian officials viewed as the final straw. Without getting into the political merits of the specific dispute, what matters for economic purposes is that Canada concluded they had more leverage than they've used historically, and they've decided to demonstrate that leverage in the most direct way possible. By controlling access to the physical infrastructure that trade flows through, Canada is showing that geographic proximity creates dependencies that run both directions. The Canadian calculation seems to be that while this hurts Canada economically, it hurts the United States more. Canada represents about 10% of global GDP, while the US represents about 25%. But for Canada, the US is far more important as a trading partner than Canada is for the US as a percentage of total trade. However, and this is the key insight, in specific sectors and regions, the dependencies are reversed. American automotive manufacturing is utterly dependent on Canadian parts. American Midwest refineries are configured for Canadian crude. American Northeast heating depends on Canadian natural gas. In those specific areas, Canada has genuine leverage, and they're using it. This also sends a signal to other countries. For years, American foreign policy operated on the assumption that allies would generally accommodate American preferences because they needed American markets, American security guarantees, or American diplomatic support, more than America needed them. Canada's actions suggest that assumption might not hold as firmly as Washington believed. If Canada, democratic, culturally similar, geographically adjacent Canada, is willing to take economic action against American interests, what does that mean for relationships with more distant allies who face their own tensions with U.S. policy? Let's talk about what this means for you personally, because these geopolitical and economic abstractions translate into concrete impacts on daily life. If you drive a car, the price you pay for gasoline is about to increase. Canadian crude oil supplies nearly half of U.S. imports. And while oil is a global commodity with global prices, regional supply disruptions cause regional price spikes. Refineries in the Midwest can't instantly switch to alternative crude sources, and the supply disruption will push up prices at gas stations in those regions immediately, with spillover effects nationally. Let me be specific about what kind of price increases we're talking about. Energy analysts are projecting that gasoline prices in Midwest states could increase by 40 to 60 cents per gallon within 2 weeks if the border restrictions persist. For a typical household that uses 50 gallons of gas per month, that's an extra $20 to $30 monthly just for transportation fuel. Nationally, the price impact would be smaller but still significant, maybe 15 to 25 cents per gallon, because supply disruptions in one region affect prices everywhere through the interconnected distribution system. Heating oil and natural gas prices face similar pressures. Households in the Northeast that heat with oil, about 5 million homes, could see heating costs increase by 20 to 30% this winter if Canadian supply becomes less reliable. For natural gas heating, which is much more common, the impacts would be somewhat smaller percentage-wise, but still material. A household that spends $150 per month on natural gas heating might see that increase to $180 or $190. Over a 6-month heating season, that's several $100s in additional costs that many families struggle to afford. Grocery prices will increase for specific categories of products. Fresh produce that crosses the border daily. Canadian greenhouse tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers during winter months when U.S. production is limited will become more expensive or simply unavailable. Dairy products, meat, processed foods that include Canadian ingredients or that move through cross-border supply chains will all see price increases. The impact won't be uniform across all groceries, but you'll notice it in your weekly shopping bill within a few weeks as existing inventory sells through and higher cost replacement inventory hits shelves. Construction materials will spike in price, particularly lumber. Canadian lumber accounts for about 1/3 of U.S. consumption, and it's concentrated in the framing lumber that's essential for home building. Lumber prices had finally stabilized after the pandemic-era surge that saw prices increase by 300 to 400% at the peak. Now we're facing another supply shock. Industry analysts suggest lumber prices could increase by 40 to 50% within a month if Canadian supplies are seriously disrupted. For someone building a 2,000 square foot home, that could mean an additional $10,000 to $15,000 in material costs. Vehicle prices are already high due to various supply chain disruptions over the past few years, and this corridor closure makes the situation worse. New vehicle inventory on dealer lots is limited, and production slowdowns caused by parts shortages will reduce inventory further. When supply is constrained and demand remains strong, prices rise. We're likely to see vehicles selling at or above manufacturer's suggested retail price, with dealer markups becoming common again. If you need a vehicle in the next 6 months, expect to pay more and have fewer choices than you would under normal circumstances. If you heat your home with natural gas, particularly if you live in the Northeast or Upper Midwest, your heating costs are vulnerable. Canada provides 95% of U.S. natural gas imports, and while those flows might not stop entirely, any reduction in reliability or any politicization of energy supplies creates price uncertainty that utilities will price into their costs, which gets passed on to consumers. Winter is coming in a few months. Families in cold climates need reliable, affordable heating. This trade corridor disruption puts that at risk. If you're planning to buy a car in the near future, expect higher prices and longer waits. Automotive supply chains are already fragile after pandemic disruptions, semiconductor shortages, and other recent challenges. This border restriction will cause production slowdowns that reduce the supply of available vehicles while demand remains constant or increases. Basic economics tells you what happens to prices when supply drops and demand stays the same. Some dealerships might not have the models you want at any price because the parts needed to build those vehicles can't cross the border efficiently. If you're building or renovating a home, lumber prices that had finally started stabilizing after pandemic spikes are about to increase again. Canadian lumber accounts for about 1/3 of U.S. consumption. concentrated particularly in framing lumber for residential construction. Builders who need lumber to complete projects will bid up prices for available supply, and those increased costs get passed on to homeowners either through higher construction costs or higher home prices generally. If you work in manufacturing, logistics, or any sector tied to cross-border trade, your job security just became more uncertain. Companies facing supply chain disruptions make hard choices about production levels, staffing, and capital investment. Some will try to ride out the disruption. Others will accelerate plans to reorganize supply chains in ways that might mean closing facilities, consolidating operations, or shifting production to locations less dependent on cross-border flows. None of those options are good for workers in affected industries and regions. The regional impacts are particularly severe in border states. Michigan's economy is deeply integrated with Ontario's. About 300,000 Michigan jobs are directly or indirectly connected to trade with Canada. In Detroit, Windsor, and surrounding communities, you can't meaningfully separate the two economies. They're one integrated economic region that happens to be bisected by an international border. When that border becomes a barrier rather than a seamless connection, the entire region suffers. Let me give you some specific examples of how this plays out in border communities. In Detroit, the automotive industry isn't just a major employer, it's the economic foundation that supports everything else. Auto engineers earn good salaries and spend that money at local restaurants, retailers, and service providers. When automotive production slows because parts can't cross the border efficiently, those engineers get furloughed or laid off. They stop spending money locally. The restaurants see fewer customers, the retailers see declining sales, the service providers lose clients. The economic pain cascades through the entire community. Trucking and logistics companies in border regions are facing immediate crisis. These companies built their business models around moving goods across the border multiple times per day. A trucking company that operates 50 trucks making cross-border trips previously could predict with reasonable accuracy how long each trip would take, how many trips per day each truck could complete, and therefore what revenue and profit to expect. When border delays become unpredictable, sometimes a trip takes the usual 30 minutes, sometimes it takes 4 hours. That entire business model breaks. Drivers sit idle waiting to cross. Fuel costs increase. Revenue per truck declines. Many of these companies operate on thin margins, and even a 20 or 30% reduction in trips per day can mean the difference between profit and loss. Warehouse and distribution operations near the border face similar challenges. These facilities were strategically located to serve as hubs for cross-border shipments. A warehouse in Buffalo that receives goods from Canada consolidates them with domestic goods and distributes throughout the Northeast made sense when the border was seamless. When border crossings become a bottleneck, that geographic advantage becomes a liability. Companies might decide to relocate distribution operations away from the border to areas less dependent on cross-border flows, which means facility closures and job losses in border communities. New York faces these challenges, particularly in the Buffalo-Niagara region. The Peace Bridge is critical infrastructure not just for the immediate area, but for a vast agricultural and manufacturing region that depends on it. New York State's agricultural exports to Canada include apples, dairy products, wine, and various specialty crops. Canadian agricultural products flowing into New York include grains, livestock, and greenhouse vegetables. When that trade becomes more difficult and expensive, farmers and food processors on both sides suffer. Some might survive by finding alternative markets or absorbing higher costs. Others won't. Washington State has extensive economic connections with British Columbia through the Pacific Highway crossing and other border points. The Seattle-Vancouver corridor is economically integrated through aerospace, technology, agriculture, and tourism. Boeing has significant operations on both sides of the border, with parts and personnel moving back and forth regularly. Technology companies in Seattle have offices and employees in Vancouver. Agricultural products from Washington, apples, wheat, dairy, flow north, while Canadian products flow south. Trade restrictions disrupt all of these connections. The tourism and hospitality industry in border regions takes an immediate hit when cross-border travel becomes more difficult. Americans who used to casually drive into Canada for shopping, dining, or entertainment stop making those trips when border delays add hours to what should be a quick outing. Similarly, Canadians who regularly crossed into the United States for similar reasons reduce those trips. Restaurants, hotels, retail stores, and entertainment venues in border cities on both sides see declining revenue. Some were already struggling after pandemic disruptions. This additional shock might push them into closure. Small businesses throughout the affected regions are particularly vulnerable because they lack the resources and flexibility that large corporations have. A small manufacturer that depends on a Canadian supplier for a critical component doesn't have a procurement department that can quickly source alternatives globally. They might not have the cash reserves to stockpile inventory as a buffer against supply disruptions. They can't easily pass increased costs on to customers who have alternatives. For many small businesses, this trade corridor closure represents an existential threat that could force them to shut down operations, lay off employees, and liquidate assets. The professional services sector, lawyers, accountants, consultants, financial advisors, see declining business when their clients in manufacturing, logistics, and trade-dependent industries face difficulties. Law firms that specialize in cross-border trade and customs issues might actually see increased work in the short term, helping clients navigate the new restrictions. But if the economic decline in their region is severe enough, even that specialized work eventually dries up as companies close or relocate. New York's border regions face similar challenges. Buffalo and its Canadian counterpart Fort Erie are economically integrated. The Peace Bridge is critical infrastructure not just for the two cities, but for vast agricultural and manufacturing regions that depend on it. Washington State has extensive economic connections with British Columbia, particularly in aerospace, technology, and agriculture. All of these regional economies were built on the assumption of easy cross-border commerce. That assumption is now in question. Small businesses are particularly vulnerable because they have less capacity to adapt than large corporations. A small manufacturer that depends on a Canadian supplier for a critical component doesn't have the resources to quickly find and qualify alternative suppliers, establish new logistics arrangements, or absorb higher costs. A small retailer that sources products through distributors who depend on cross-border supply chains doesn't have the market power to demand priority treatment when supplies get scarce. These businesses face existential threats from disruptions that larger competitors might weather. The broader economic implications are sobering. The $900 billion that flows through this corridor isn't just trade, it's the foundation for employment, tax revenue, investment, and growth on both sides of the border. Economic modeling suggests that a sustained 30% reduction in cross-border trade would reduce U.S. GDP by roughly 0.5%, which sounds small until you realize that's about $125 billion in lost economic output. That translates to somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 jobs, depending on which sectors get hit hardest. But it's not just about the numbers. It's about the psychology of businesses and investors. When policy becomes unpredictable, when assumptions that held for decades suddenly break, capital becomes cautious. Companies delay investments. Entrepreneurs postpone expansions. Investors demand higher returns to compensate for increased risk. That caution and delay has its own economic cost and opportunities foregone, and growth that doesn't happen. The uncertainty itself is economically damaging even before any specific business failures or job losses occur. So can this be reversed? Can the corridor be reopened and normal trade flows restored? The honest answer is that nobody knows. It depends on negotiations between two governments that are currently quite far apart. It depends on whether domestic political pressures in either country push leaders toward compromise or entrenchment. It depends on whether the economic pain becomes severe enough quickly enough that both sides have incentive to find an off-ramp. The challenge is that once you've taken an action this dramatic, backing down becomes politically difficult. For Canada, reopening the corridor without securing concessions would look like capitulation. For the United States, making significant concessions would look like giving in to economic coercion. Both governments face domestic audiences that will judge them on whether they stood firm or appeared weak. That political dynamic makes compromise harder even when both sides would benefit economically from resolving the dispute. There's also the question of precedent. If Canada successfully uses access to trade infrastructure as leverage to change U.S. policy, does that encourage other countries to try similar tactics? Does it make America's alliances more transactional and less stable? Does it accelerate a trend toward economic regionalization and away from the integrated global trading system that has generally supported prosperity for decades? These are questions that extend well beyond the immediate bilateral dispute. For businesses and individuals trying to navigate this situation, the key is to understand your exposure and plan accordingly. If your business depends on cross-border supply chains, you need contingency plans immediately. That might mean securing alternative suppliers, building inventory buffers, or communicating with customers about potential delays and price increases. If your job is in a trade-exposed sector, you need to assess how secure your position is and what your options would be if the situation deteriorates. If you're a consumer, understanding which products and prices are most vulnerable helps you make informed decisions about major purchases. The next few weeks are absolutely critical. Both governments are under pressure to show they're taking the economic concerns seriously while not appearing to back down from their positions. Behind-the-scenes negotiations are likely happening even as public rhetoric remains tough. Business groups on both sides of the border are lobbying their governments to find a resolution before temporary disruptions become permanent damage. Watch for signals of movement. If you start seeing reports of working-level officials meeting to discuss technical details of potential agreements, that's a positive sign. If you see any softening in public rhetoric from either side, that might indicate progress behind the scenes. Conversely, if you see additional restrictions being implemented or retaliatory measures being announced, that suggests escalation rather than resolution. The stock market is already pricing in these concerns. Shares of companies with heavy Canada trade exposure have declined notably. Automotive manufacturers, pipeline operators, cross-border retailers, all are seeing selling pressure as investors try to assess the magnitude and duration of the disruption. If you have investments in these sectors, you're probably seeing portfolio value decline. Whether to hold through the volatility or reduce exposure is a decision that depends on your risk tolerance and investment timeline. But make it an informed decision based on understanding the risks. So here's where we are. Canada has locked the United States out of a $900 billion trade corridor, implementing actual restrictions on border crossings that handle an extraordinary volume of commerce critical to both economies. Warren Buffett, who rarely comments on geopolitical matters, has issued a warning that the economic damage will be severe and that some businesses simply won't survive the disruption. The impacts are already visible in backed-up trucks, production slowdowns, and supply chain stress, and they will become more pronounced in the coming days and weeks through higher prices, product shortages, and job losses. This matters for every American, because the integrated supply chains that this corridor enabled touch virtually every aspect of daily life. The gas in your car, the heat in your home, the groceries in your refrigerator, the products you buy, the job you depend on, all of these are connected to trade flows that are now disrupted. The question isn't whether this affects you, the question is how severely and how quickly you'll feel the impacts. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now by leaders in Washington and Ottawa, whether they find a way to de-escalate and restore normal trade flows, or whether this becomes a prolonged disruption that forces businesses and supply chains to fundamentally reorganize, will shape the North American economy for years. The integrated economic system that made both countries more prosperous is breaking. Fixing it will require leadership, compromise, and recognition that some fights aren't worth the economic cost. Keep an eye on this story because it's developing rapidly and the stakes couldn't be higher. The trade corridor that seemed permanent and unassailable is now closed. The supply chains that seemed unbreakable are breaking. And the economic partnership that seemed too valuable for either side to jeopardize is being jeopardized by decisions that may have looked reasonable in isolation, but that create cascading consequences neither side fully anticipated. We're watching in real time as assumptions that held for generations break down, and the question now is whether the damage can be contained or whether we're at the start of a much larger unraveling of North American economic integration.